Elevator systems. Bowen family systems theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, where we look at ideas and concepts from Bowen family systems theory in brief and hopefully understandable ways. Today is the first episode of season 4, where our episodes will cover mild, medium, and hot topics. Basically, what are the things you don't talk about at the dinner table because it might get people riled up? And so as an introduction for today, we are looking at polarization and how this idea fits with Bowen theory's understanding of the forces of individuality and togetherness. Joining us is someone who recently collaborated on this topic with our own Katie. They did a sort of together two-person presentation on togetherness at the Bowen Center's 62nd annual symposium. Dr. Barbara Laymon is joining us today. Welcome to the podcast, Barbara.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Barbara is a family systems consultant, a writer, and a researcher. Her latest book, All the Families of the Earth, is a fictional piece imagining family therapists at work behind the scenes of biblical stories. Her most recent academic article involved a validated scale of congregational functioning, published in the Journal of Pastoral Psychology, and I'll put links to both of those in the show notes. And her grandchildren call her Babs. But I won't call you Babs. I will call you Barbara. And you get to give the first elevator pitch on polarization and Bowen theory's individuality and togetherness forces.
Well, 3 words: individuality and togetherness. That's my pitch. The way I think about it is when things get tense, it's good to have a goal in mind. And the goal is just how to be an individual and how to have a togetherness process that's mature. So when I think about the individuality, what I want is I want to be clear about who I am and what I'm thinking, but I don't want to coerce others into trying to get them to think the same way. I want to respect who they are. And then when I think about the togetherness piece, I think about just wanting to be interested in the other person and being respectful of them and what they're trying to think about and what they're trying to say. So under pressure, of course, those things get harder to do, but having it as a goal in mind, I think is a good start.
Excellent.
I think I'm going to pick up on some of the same ideas. I think the thing that I wanted to think about with togetherness and individuality is that these are 2 evolutionarily driven forces that are part of the human and other natural systems. So really thinking about that pull to be part of a group and have autonomy in self. So I think those interacting forces can create some of these things we observe in a family and out in the world. So Barbara added some of the things I was going to add about. I think context and tension are very important variables to think about with this. So people can have and share different ideas and be in relationship, but when tension rises in a system or a society, a family, there's greater pressure to be on the same side. And I think at some level, this pressure to be on the same side is due to a desire for safety. I'm happy to nerd out and talk a little bit about kind of that togetherness force. I've been reading a lot from an evolutionary perspective, really is part of what kept us moving forward as a species, is collaboration and being on the same page with things. But yet there's still also this competitive drive to be a self. So I think I'm looking forward to talking more about that. Right. Dixie, what have you got?
My pitch, let me find it on the page here. So I sort of described polarization is the tug of war we experience, not about which side of a topic we land, but the tension and pressure we experience about seeing things differently than others. That's the tug of war, not about the side of a topic necessarily. I have from Dr. Bowen, for some reason, the human brain is open to polarities, to opposing viewpoints, and the human struggle wants to argue these viewpoints, and the media debates want to set up the polarities and get people to argue on them. So the human being is set up for arguing polarities. There is a never-ending supply of polarities. And then also wanted to highlight, we've had Ron Richardson on the podcast before. He wrote this little book called Polarization and the Healthier Church. And he describes polarization from chemistry, from physics, and the cultural relational parts. And his quote is, "The main problem in relationships is not that there are differences. What matters is the level of anxiety people bring to the encounter they have around those differences. Those with higher levels of anxiety will have more difficulties and more sensitivity to each other." All right. Short and sweet. What do you guys notice?
Well, it's interesting to me that when we're talking about polarizations, individuality and togetherness both is one, but it's separate from others to me. It's sort of the polarization under the other polarizations in some ways. It's the processes.
Versus the topics or the things that divide us.
Well, there's a lot of opposites running around in the world, but but somehow these don't operate in exactly that same way, because what I've noticed is that any increase in individuality, in the maturity of one's individuality, is accompanied by an increase in the togetherness force and how the person expresses that togetherness force in their life. So they seem to move together up and down the maturity, immaturity of the expression of the forces.
Well, I was hoping you'd say more. I have it written down to say more about what mature and immaturity looks like in both of these.
Okay. Well, I have a couple of examples, but I don't want to rush it if there's other things y'all want to say before we launch into examples.
No, I think go ahead, Will. Or did you have something more, Katie?
I mean, the only thing I really appreciated that was kind of in all of these comments, I did a little deep dive on getting into physics, which is not an area of strong suit, and just thinking about how much polarities are just a necessary process in life. And so I think one of the things I appreciated about all of these pitches is just really recognizing that polarities just are, us having different ways of thinking, different ways of being. I appreciate that Barbara's going to talk about that, even along the continuum of individuality or togetherness, that there are these different ways of being. And I think that's something that I just wanted to make sure was kind of, that I've read a lot about, is this is just a natural way that, a natural thing that exists in nature.
Okay, well, I'm really glad you said that, because that is something I meant to say, and now I'm going to remember to say it, which is that this is not the like cold and hot, and so the middle is warm. Okay, so individuality and togetherness are thought of, at least, as two different forces, and they don't, you don't decrease one to increase the other, in my view. Now, the balance of individuality and togetherness, the set point for it, the ratio for it in a group, depends on the maturity of the group, is what I think is going on. So I'm just gonna give an example of that. I have two examples. One is people and one is prairie dogs. But I'll go with the people first, and then if we have time, I'll do the prairie dogs also. But the family that I want to use is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's family. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, of course, lived in the middle of the 20th century and died a martyr in Germany at the end of World War II. But he didn't do this by himself. He had 3 other family members who also died in the same cause, and a lifetime of effort by the family in this work. So I thought I did a dive into his family story and found so many interesting things. But they were well-to-do people. His father was the head psychiatrist at the big hospital in Berlin. His mother was trained as a teacher. Her mother took piano lessons from Clara Schumann. So you can see the kind of where they came from. This turns out to be important in Germany in that time period after World War I, because many people were hungry. People were reporting, I worked all week and I got one loaf of bread. I got enough money for one loaf of bread and a pound of butter. That kind of thing was going on. But the Bonhoeffer family was well off. And so the resources were available to them, and they were not under that kind of intense pressure. And I want to keep that in mind, because I think it does make a difference in how people were responding at the time. In the Bonhoeffer family, the mother chose to homeschool the children because she thought that the public schools were too harsh. They had tons of fun. They had lots of plays, lots of music, lots of friends in and out of the home in the evening. But at the same time, there was a requirement that the children were articulate. And the father was quite insistent about this. If they said something that was half-baked, he would immediately respond and ask them what they were saying and ask them to be clear. And I think that's so interesting. In other words, the pressure was not on the children to think the same way, to articulate the same view. The pressure was on the children to be clear about what they thought. Mm-hmm. And you see, I think that is a higher level of togetherness. If the togetherness force is pressuring everyone to think the same way, I see that as less mature. If the togetherness force is pressuring people to be more articulate, I see that as a little more mature, or maybe much more mature. And then that also impacts the individuality of the family, because the members of the family are, in essence, in my view, being encouraged to be clear about themselves and what they're thinking. And so it's interesting to me the way that each one plays off the other, and how the two would both contribute to greater maturity in that family. So to summarize, some of the things that happens when the togetherness force is less mature is not only this pressure for everyone to think alike, but this pressure to ostracize people who don't, or their own desire to leave. So you get into these cutoff situations. But there's also this, in less mature togetherness, an immediate, a sort of instinctive level, let's find someone to blame. So in other words, instead of thinking systems, people start thinking individual. There's someone in the wrong here. And an immature togetherness does lead to that kind of blameful posturing. It also, of course, leads to helplessness versus a family with more resourcefulness, which I would see as more maturity. Now, I'm using Dr. Paparo's family functioning scale in these categories. And there's a story from the Bonhoeffer family that makes a lot of sense to me. The grandmother came to Berlin, I think when her spouse died, and this was in the 1920s. And in 1933, the Nazis decided to close all the department stores that were run by Jews. Or I think at that point they were just telling people they couldn't go into the department stores. And so this is Mrs. Bonhoeffer, this is the paternal grandmother. She got dressed in her very best clothes. She walked up to the Nazi line. She said, "I always shop at Bergdorf's." And they just backed off and let her through. Well, you see, that is someone that is using her own resourcefulness to do what she can in her situation. And I think that it set an example for the children that stayed with them, and grandchildren, Dietrich Bonhoeffer being one, that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. That this is how our family is going to operate. So I think the story tells us a lot about mature individuality and togetherness.
Yeah, and willing to take risks. I think that's a part of it for something that you believe in.
Yeah, and what does it take to stay the course when things got so deadly serious?
Yeah. I think that so I didn't bring a specific example, but I was in a meeting the other day with John Bell, who we've had on the podcast before, and he threw out this I guess equation that I've been thinking about was so relevant for our talking today, which was, he said, differences plus level of differentiation equals the level of tension. So differences, he spoke of like feeling, thinking, or actions, and you take that along the level of differentiation, and that will produce the tension. In our discussion, he added potentially that level of stressors might go into that equation, but I thought it made a lot of sense as, Barbara, picking up on your comment, like as the stressors increased for these folks as time went on in Berlin, how does that increase the level of tension? Yet their ability to be clear and continue to stay the course. I think that speaks to this work on polarization, in the sense of the ability to hold a position, to be clear in the face of other, yet it's going to produce this tension in self, in the system, and how does that play out?
Are you saying, Katie, that literally taking a position increases the tension? Is that what you're saying?
I think if there's enough difference and stress in the system, I think it could. I don't think it automatically could. It would, but I think dependent upon, this is where I think context for me becomes, an important piece. Like I think if I take a position in a system where people all think like me, I think that potentially involves a very low level of tension. But if I'm taking a position in an area where people think quite differently, or where there's a variation in that, it would have a higher level of tension that it adds to the system.
I'm not sure. I mean, sometimes when I quit waffling and just land, it just feels so much better, regardless.
Within or between?
Yeah, that's
or
a good
both?
question.
In me, it just whatever, but yeah.
I remember listening to a psychologist talk a while ago. I think he was on Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, that said, basically that's the key, like just make the decision.
Yeah.
The tension and anxiety that arises in sitting in that unknown space, whether, you grow to appreciate or not appreciate the decision, the making of the decision will just help some of that anxiety ease out.
Yeah.
It kind of fits with my example. I was thinking of COVID, and I often said none of us were sitting around in 2019 thinking that life was so amazing, right? And then suddenly, 2020 got real stressful. And in my brain, it intensified. What did I say here? It intensified the fact that we all see the world differently. And how do you manage relationships when you see things differently? But COVID was different because you literally wore your position on your face, or by getting vaccinated or not. Like, it was very, very aware. And I remember I lived in small town Alberta at the time, and in my little town, I would feel stressed when I went to the grocery store with a mask on because you knew that people thought I was being silly. that wasn't necessary, right? And so in my mind, it was just a real. I mean, there was lots of stress in the world, but it was very sort of clear where you landed on things before masks became mandated.
Yeah, I've been thinking, I don't know the answer to this, but I think COVID is such an interesting time to think about where did it increase the overtness of some of this we think differently? Um, did it put more information into the system? I think from a family systems perspective, did we have conversations with our family members and our friends about what they thought about various things? And so this brought a content into the discussion that just gave us more data. And what do we do with that data at a time where we're all pretty tense and stressed? I don't know what another example of that in our lives would be, but I think there's a lot to think about. I still see the fallout in some of the kind of polarities that were developed during families over the time of COVID that's still in my office today. Like they still come up.
Well, that human tendency to be self-conscious if one is different from the group, it's so interesting, and it's good to be aware of it. It's good to notice it when it's happening, and be able to make the choice for self that one needs to make. But it does wear a person down. One does. I mean, there is a cost somehow.
Yeah. And it's so baked into our evolution. I'm reading Sarah Blaffer Hardy's book, Father Time, and she's kind of going through the evolution, and we're ironically at that place right now in the book where it's talking about how that thinking about what other people think about us. I mean, that's a few species ago that really it's so evolutionarily baked into how we interact in a group that I think we just need to acknowledge that it's a fact in our system. And how do we relate to that fact in the system?
Well, and I would be Bowen theory remiss if I didn't mention right now that what is happening inside of oneself between one's intellectual system and one's emotional system is what is happening between oneself and other people.
Yeah.
So that, my favorite book anymore is Jacques Panksepp's Affective Neuroscience. And the fact that we are so much like other mammalian species, and those bottom-up emotions have so much power inside of our brains. And our little tiny prefrontal cortex can do all it wants to, but if the bottom-up is strong enough, it really does shut down the messages back, is my understanding. And so the capacity to work on oneself internally, which I think also does happen in relationships with other family members, allows the brain to grow itself up somewhat. I think.
I mean, taking that, if I were to try and translate that, are you thinking about when I, as an individual, really struggle to get a sense of what I'm thinking and feeling and how I get clear on that for the purpose today, like about a topic, I'm also equally going to struggle in my relationships around how I communicate and hold steady in that topic.
That's, I mean, this isn't my idea. This is, I think, Dr. Bowen's, I know it's in Dr. Kerr's books, this description that what is happening within is mirrored between. Yeah, it's in both. But the way I think about it, and I'm so glad, Katie, that you brought up how species evolved But that since the beginning of time, these two forces have been active. And in living things, Victoria Harrison's work on how it started off that individuality was more present as the earliest living organisms scattered everywhere on Earth. And then they began to band together as they saw advantage to working together. It's just so fascinating how from the very beginning we've had both of these things going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard Dr. Papero, he did a whole day with Family Systems Institute in Australia on polarization and highlighting cooperation and competition. Like, it's just everywhere. Isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, and you see, that reminds me of prairie dogs.
Yeah. Good.
So prairie dogs are a species that live in small groups of about 25 or less, 10 to 25 individuals. And they're called coteries, with a couple of males and several breeding females and their children and grandchildren. And they live in these areas, about an acre and a half of land for one coterie, but they all live contiguous to each other. Now, they defend their little acre and a half from each other. They don't let them, individual prairie dogs cross them, or they'll run them off. But except in mating season, which lasts a few days, I think. I'm right about that. Anyhow, other than that, they're very defensive of their little coterie space, and they're very careful in how they take care of it, very resourceful with that. And they basically hand it down to the next generation of females. They stay in that spot. So some of those burrows will be 150 years old or older. At any rate, all the prairie dogs in the entire colony, their land is contiguous to each other because of the need to defend against predators. So that if there's a predator in the air, like a hawk, on the ground like a coyote, or underground like a snake, one prairie dog will set off the first alarm, which is relayed across the entire colony. And the alarm is, coyote moving fast, whatever. And it's interesting how low the level of, success in predation. Their estimates are like around 15%, because they've got such a good alarm system. So you see that they need each other. I mean, the togetherness is really important. And the leading researcher on this, John Hughlin, says that they are more clumped up than they need to be. In other words, the colony, there's land around it, but they don't expand because they like the nearness. And you can see the comfort probably keeps their anxiety down. So the way prairie dogs operate is that they're not all monitoring. Some monitor for threat much more of the time than others. Some are much more vigilant, some are much less, and this changes year to year. So it does show the individuality of these different individuals, but they are united in their defense against the threat.
My mind started going in so many places, Barbara, thinking about translating that to humans, thinking about just this knowledge that we're a little more spread out from family systems. And I think, it's a curiosity. Does that put us on a little higher alert to not know who our clan is that we're thinking about? Does that contribute to some of these polarizations? I don't know. I'm going to go think about that one a little bit more.
The individual who distances from the family, that person may be highly successful at work, but my data suggests that their life satisfaction is much lower. than individuals that manage to both be successful at work and stay connected with their family. I don't know why I got off on that. I forget.
Well, I said people distancing. Yeah. And I think that's interesting to think about, this family, I always see do I push that a little bit further and say, a created community, or some people will say like a chosen family, that these folks that they connect with, versus being much more isolated and cut off from others. I think that's an interesting thing to just watch.
I'll put it in the show notes. I was watching Dr. Papero on Family Matters, and he said running away from the group is not the same thing as autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one piece of it. And then I watched the Two Popes movie with Anthony Hopkins a while ago, but this stuck with me. His character says, "No, I've changed. Compromise is something else." And I'm like, how does a person know the difference between changing thoughtfully or compromising or conforming, I guess?
That's a really good quote, isn't it? That's really, yeah. Because compromising suggests something's been given up.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking it maybe go off to an example that I'd probably come up with a million things about parents. How many times parents will come into your office and say, we want to be on the same page, right? And I think that's a piece of this, right? Is how do you, as a couple parenting a child, kind of think through how do you maintain your autonomy and also still, have that relationship, that means of togetherness for the family system. Do you have a belief system as a family system? That was very muddled. It did not come out well.
Well, and does your family have goals? What is it trying to do? And I don't want to, I don't want to make too much of goals, because I think we can get worn out with too many of them. I mean, life is what it is. But at the same time, I think that it is clear what a family basically is trying to do. But or not, I guess, would be the other way to put it. It's clear that the family is not clear, I guess. But how can the family move itself along in that arena? And you see, I think like for prairie dogs, the big deal about their cooperation is that they need each other. They and so how does a family unit start to see that and work to make that happen?
Yeah. I think that's a little bit of my takeaway that related to that, which was, how I think we are in pretty polar. I think there's a lot of intensity around polarization right now. So how do you, as an individual within your family, within your friend group, just get interested in what the people around you think, and simultaneously getting clear about what you think and believe? And when do you lose that? When can you hold on to that in the face of the other? I think that just is a useful exercise for myself. I think it's a useful exercise for others, just to be interested. I think both of you mentioned this element of being interested in the other, being able to share your beliefs without trying to change them. And I think if I'll speak for myself, if I'm pretty passionate about something, that's hard. I think that's hard to do, is to not move forward always with the effort of trying to change the other's thinking, but just get real interested in what they're thinking about. And in my case, in some of my conversations I have in my own families, and also knowing when to walk away, knowing when I've lost my ability to hold on to, my clarity and myself, and just saying, all right, let's take a time out. Let's come back to this. But I just think that's something I'd encourage folks to go out in the world and practice and think about.
Yeah, it fits nicely with my takeaway was going to be I'll link. There's a YouTube video. It's a commercial from Denmark. I think it's almost 10 years old now. But it talks about how we put people in boxes, and they bring these they introduce the groups of people all separately, and they walk in, and, they're all sort of dressed, the businessmen, the nurses, the sporty people, the tough guys in leather, right? And then they start asking different questions about who loves to dance, or who's a step parent, and they go from their boxes and you see just the us them sort of disappear as we think about just different pieces of these people's stories. And I don't know, I find it very helpful to me in terms of, can I just think about a person beyond this topic that we presumably disagree on?
I love that.
Yeah.
I was thinking one example I forgot to say that I was going to say, we're recording this during the Olympics, and there's this beautiful commercial that I meant to say as one of my examples that it must be for sporting goods, but it shows various team rivalries sitting next to each other. My example is the Chicago Bears and the Green Bay Packers, and they're like these grumpy, they like all these rivalries in various sports. And because it's the Olympics, then they show them watching, or in this case, it's an American commercial, the United States, and how these different sides can come together, focused on, we can all be a member of this team, even though other times we might have this intense rivalry. And I thought it was just another little example of kind of how context can shift, group membership can shift some of this togetherness that you're thinking about. I thought it was just another interesting example of just putting those ideas out there.
Well, the Olympics has made me think about the fact that nobody can have it all. And so if you're going to be an Olympic athlete, you're going to give up a lot of other things to get there. And each of us has that choice to make in terms of our own individuality. And I think that's something that I'm getting more and more aware of, is that it's a choice what one does, but it makes a difference when one sticks with what one has chosen. I mean, a difference for self.
Yeah.
And sometimes it doesn't feel like a choice, or we don't experience it as a choice.
When the hard work sets in, yeah.
Did you have anything else, resource or takeaway, Barbara, that you wanted to share?
Just that staying clear about this goal of individuality and togetherness, I think is a handy kind of thing that's in your pocket that you can pull out. And in a tough moment, one can step back and think about what's happening in the togetherness and what's happening in oneself, and make maybe a little bit more informed decision about how one is going to act when anxiety and tension are up. That's all.
It's a good ending note.
Easy.
Yes. Good. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Barbara.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this very much. I appreciate it.
And I'm going to add that if you would like to support the efforts of the behind the scenes work of this podcast, we will put a link in to our coffee donation area where we can request kindly that you support the efforts it takes to make this happen. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good. And I hope our listeners today take away lots of things to observe in yourself as you go out into the world these days, and as you go out into your relationships. This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.